Yesterday, Wednesday, was one of the most high volume days of movement and incident, I think, that's happened in the whole circle of stories regarding the Middle East that we have seen in recent times. We're going to go through these in chronological order because I think that's the only way to do them, because it was just such an eventful day, such a shocking day in many ways, and there were a lot of things which caught people off guard. Starting, I suppose, generally with the humanitarian situation in Gaza, which has been described obviously as a catastrophe. People still waiting for aid to get through. Aid was allowed through initially to the Palestinian side, then it wasn't distributed. Then late last night it finally was distributed. Still only, though, Gavan, in a small, minuscule amount in comparison to what's actually needed there. And it seemed for a while that the international pressure on Israel had reached a new level.
Yeah, it's been very fascinating this week, given that we've talked so much about the demands from Ireland and Spain, for example, to have the EU reconsider its trade ties with Israel, and how they've been looking for that since February of last year. That there's been a tipping point this week where now it seems that a lot of the rest of the European Union is singing off the same hymn sheet, that 17 of the 27 member states this week have now said that we're at a kind of a crucial tipping point. We've had the UK suspending its trade talks for future associations with Israel. And it does seem that there's an international running around now where I'm not sure what the discrete point was, where they've suddenly decided that what was apparently previously tolerable is now intolerable. But either way, there's unequivocally some tipping point that we've reached in the last little while where they've now decided that they can't just stand back and be passive actors in this anymore. I wonder, is it some of the point that we were making last week, of the discussion we were having around the manner in which aid was being distributed, and Israel deciding to be more hands-on about that and kind of trying to circumvent the UN out of the whole process, but to one small extent? Yeah,
but the way that Israel wants to distribute the aid has been condemned by absolutely everybody with a modicum of sense and morality, because you can't, under armed guard, screen people, hold people, push people around as an occupying force, which is what they are under international law. People who are civilians who have been starved for, like, it's not just taking the UN out of it, it's taking all agencies out of it, and you're putting private American companies involved in this process while the IDF stand there and say, well, you're not allowed in, we don't know, we think you might be part of Hamas, even though they don't have any way of proving that. So that's really the problem there. That is a good question, though, and Zara, was interested in your thoughts on this. Why do you think there was some element of a tipping point there in terms of international opinion that you started to see? It was very noticeable, even like UK papers, in terms of what the way they covered it over the last week in comparison to the lack of coverage or to the way that they covered it previously.
Well, I think, Richard, the reality is, we're seeing the pictures there. Even if you're watching on TV, you've seen the pictures rolling. It is devastating and shocking to see, despite the many months that have passed, those images of people starving, reaching out with their bowls for food to be handed to them. We know that Gaza needs at least 600 aid trucks a day coming through that passage in order for people to be fed sustainably. I think it's less than 100 trucks that have actually managed to make their way through. There does just come a point where it's an undeniable fact that this is not okay. This is simply unacceptable. And I think that the UK really had no other choice but to step up and join the international calls on this.
It is interesting because it is obviously impossible to ignore when you reach a point where you're 11 weeks into a blockade. You have people like Tom Fletcher from the UN saying, thousands of babies are at risk of dying due to malnutrition. They simply don't get the nutrients because their mothers haven't eaten. They're in need of life-saving supplements. I still feel at some point when we look back on this time, it feels like there's now a cover of respectability and officialdom in that media organisations and people who haven't spoken about it now feel safe to do so.
Yeah.
Because they start to see people like Keir Starmer, a human rights lawyer, by the way, finally coming out to talk about the deprivation of food. Knowingly from people, and the boasting about it by people in the Israeli government. That's not a controversial thing to say either.
No,
that is literally the facts.
But why did it take Keir Starmer to say it when, I mean, the other people, aside from other international leaders in different countries that have been doing it, but why was it controversial for Miss Rachel to be talking about it on Instagram for now and her getting slaughtered by the American establishment and getting all sorts of cancellation threats for saying, could you stop killing children, please? It's really not a very contentious thing to be entertaining. But it seems like there's almost this strength in numbers thing where people have decided, actually, no, in polite company now, we can call this out for what it is. And maybe it was a fear of looking like you were being insensitive to the separate, definite trauma that Israel and its people have gone through, but that they're now at a point where they have to just say, no, enough is enough. And what you're doing now goes far beyond any retribution or strategic approach on Hamas. now it's punishment of the people. And we just can't stand by and let that happen.
I do find it fascinating. It does remind me that quote which has been circulating for so long about at some point in the future, everybody's going to say that they were always against this.
Yeah.
It does feel like that point on a lower level has been reached. And it does feel strange when you're starting to see editorials from places like the Financial Times saying this needs to stop. Where have these voices been for so long? Because this hasn't been even a graduated step up. This has been the situation that's existed since the ceasefire went. Never mind the situation before the ceasefire went, where there was still a deprivation of aid, where there was still the killing of thousands and thousands of civilians. So that's the situation that we're in.
Like, this isn't the first time there's been humanitarian blockades either. Like, how many times were we talking 12, 15, 18 months ago about aid trucks piling up at the Rafah crossing, unable to cross in to bring urgent aid to the people who needed it? Like, it's now that on an exceptionally dire scale. But the withholding and the impeding of aid to those who need it is not new in this.
Yeah.
So why there's a sudden now rush to condemn it, I don't know.
Can I ask both of you, though, what difference do you think it's going to make now when we hear from the likes of Keir Starmer? Do we feel there's going to be a substantial shift and a move in the next couple of days?
I wonder, and I think we're going to come on to the reason why I do wonder about this, because events have superseded things. And I do feel that even if you look at the news coverage from some of the places that had come around to understanding that what's happening in Gaza is the biggest humanitarian catastrophe, and it is a pressing matter, it is the biggest story in the world. The coverage of Gaza, and not saying that it isn't legitimate for the situation in Washington DC to be covered, because it is. It's a huge story. Yeah. It's the killing of diplomats. Killing of diplomats is a complete no matter where they are in the world.
Absolutely.
But that has pushed Gaza right down off the pages again. And it has. And I would be the first one to say, when people come to me on the internet and they're like, how come X, Y, and Z isn't being covered? Or how come this isn't anywhere? And you just open I'm the first person to dig it out and say, look, it actually is there. Yeah. You've just heard somebody else say that it isn't there. But it isn't there today. It isn't there in the same way that it was there yesterday. It isn't there in the same way that it was the day before. I do wonder, and we'll come around to some of the fallout of what's happened in Washington, D.C. I do wonder if that energy, that condemnation continues. And even if it does actually make a difference, Zara, condemnation is something which has circled around the Israeli assault on Gaza for however many months now. It hasn't stopped them in any way. The Israeli government has hit back at the European leaders in particular, who have been condemning them this week. Even people, though, in the Trump administration, I think, are finally coming around to saying, look, we don't want this on our television screens. You had people like Marco Rubio, even Donald Trump himself, saying people are starving there. And I think when you start to lose American public opinion, when the situation is being beamed to homes on NBC, on CNN, CBS News, ABC, it's very hard to sort of say, well, look, we're in control of the situation. There's a clear, defined plan here.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to be in a situation, Richard, where people are publicly condemning this day after day and see no change. It's very frustrating for people who are out campaigning. You know, from day one, we've seen people across this country having Free Palestine demonstrations. We've seen people who've been to the forefront of that campaign. And for those people, it must be incredibly frustrating to feel that every day you're consuming these pictures and these images and the lived reality for people in Gaza. And yet at the same time, we're still in a situation where children are starving, the trucks are not being allowed in, and we're nowhere near a ceasefire. Of course, it's very frustrating. But what's the alternative? Stop talking about it and let the voices fall silent. That's not a viable alternative either.
It might be just worth making one observation. I don't disagree with that, but it's kind of a side point, which is that when Israel announced a couple of weeks ago what it was planning to do with its latest escalation of its campaign in Gaza, with effectively the forcible moving of people down to the south so that they could effectively then cleanse the north because they thought only Hamas would be left. A lot of that was being done on the presumption that when Donald Trump was in the Middle East last week, that he'd make a visit to Israel and that there'd be some kind of leverage used where Trump would be able to pull Israel back maybe from the excesses of what it was announcing if there was some kind of prisoner swap or hostage exchange in the meantime. And then Trump, because he apparently now is also upset or frustrated with Netanyahu's unwillingness to budge or play ball, just decided, I have nothing nice to say, so I'm not going to go there. And there's a theory that actually Israel never quite intended for things to be as urgent as it was, but was doing some things so that it had scope to pull back. But now, because they've lost even some of the American support that they've got, that they're now in this situation where they can't even climb down for fear that it looks like it's a massive concession on their part, with the appalling consequence that there is immense man-made. And like, we've kind of glossed over the man-madeness, or we've become very immune to it or eyes glazed over to it. The man-made nature of this desperate crisis. This is like of a grade of, like, you know, famine like we had in Ethiopia or Rwanda in the late 1980s and 1990s. Like something equivalent and worse than that. caused by human activity,
Yep.
which now can't be pulled back from because there was a political miscalculation somewhere along the way. And that's appalling.
The Palestinian Red Crescent Society says no aid has been distributed to Gaza yet today so far. As well as that, evacuation orders are in place for 14 areas of northern Gaza. Then yesterday, we had the situation develop in Jenin in the West Bank, where a group of diplomats and officials were being shown around by local authorities there to effectively the refugee camp of Jenin in the West Bank, which has been undergoing intense and increased Israeli military activity in recent times. And there they came under fire. There was warning shots fired, repeated warning shots fired, and some very shocking footage which reached us on our news wires of that delegation, effectively with the IDF soldiers pointing the guns towards them and firing over their heads. Scurrying away, scampering towards cars and cover. Some of them were doing interviews on TV at that moment in time. Again, a complete... I mean, the IDF then apologised for the inconvenience of it, said that they'd strayed from the agreed route which they were meant to travel on. Simon Harris today saying, do they think we're all thick? Was exactly what his response to that was. But again, it seemed it sparked another wave of condemnation. But again, you just wonder if condemnation actually does achieve anything.
No,
I just think there's so many random apologies for these sort of incidents, though, over the last little while. There's been so many, oh, oops, sorry. Like, how is that acceptable?
But what's remarkable about in this instance that it's not even so much an oops sorry, it's there was a misunderstanding because we had a plan and you guys strayed from it because you were in an area you weren't supposed to be. I mean, it is worth stressing for people that whenever you do coordinated diplomatic visits like this, if this is an amalgamation of loads of diplomats from loads of countries, including the Irish embassy there,
two Irish diplomats
on something of a fact-finding mission on this, the IDF are told, right, diplomats are going to be in this area. It's almost like it's explicitly demarcated, being like, this is a complete no-go area because there are diplomats of other countries here and you don't go near them. So even the idea that you're firing somewhere because you're like, oh, hang on, we didn't think you were going to be there. Like that is a very charitable explanation of a misunderstanding. What's more likely is that it was a very brazen, aggressive attempt to try and make sure that you were aware of Israel's presence. Actually, what it reminds me of in a way is the similar situation. Do you remember when Simon Harris was in Lebanon making a visit to Camp Shamrock a couple of months ago? And even when he was inside Lebanese territory, out to see the UNIFIL guys, and he wasn't anywhere close to the Israeli border, but there was still Israeli surveillance drones keeping an eye on things, just as this kind of very explicit gesture of supervision, being like, we're here, we're watching everything. And it's hard to properly articulate in the diplomatic community, firstly, how inappropriate, but also how kind of unsettling that is. You're not supposed to have these covert shows of strength. Like, you're in someone else's territory. This is not your ballpark to play in. But it's a continuing pattern of just diplomatic aggression from Israel as much as anything else.
I absolutely don't see how it could be viewed as anything other than a level of hostility or an act of hostility. How could it not be seen as that?
The next twist in the day then came sometime around the evening time. I think it was about 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening by the time I saw it. We covered it a couple of weeks ago on the podcast. Kneecap being investigated by counterterror police in the UK after video surfaced or was found or was dug out relating to previous concerts of theirs. The news came out last night, though, that Liam hAnnaidh, part of Kneecap, Mo Chara, he has been charged with a terror offence for allegedly displaying a flag in support of Hezbollah at a gig in London. This footage was given to the police on the 22nd of April, which was after their Coachella performance, of course. The offence, or the alleged offence, 21st November from last year. Now, this is a big blow. We talked about whether or not this would impact Kneecap, the investigation. The fact that his court appearance before a magistrate's court, which is a non-jury court, so this is on the lower end of seriousness for these offences, but still you will be judged by one person, a magistrate, rather than a jury of your peers. This happens in the middle of effectively their big UK tour, including events like Glastonbury, like other festivals around the UK and Ireland as well.
And moreover, it seems like it might then be paving the way for some of the other matters that we discussed a few weeks ago, which are also under parallel investigation, to then progress a bit further as well. Like, it was a little surprising when it first came out last night, Wednesday night, that there wasn't an immediate charge about some of the comments made about the only good Tory MP being dead and so on. But you can't say that that's not also going to happen further down the line as well. So commercially, it's a big thing for them. There's a side point which gets a little bit away from the affairs of the Middle East, though, which makes you wonder, are the British counter-terrorism police now going to start investigating basically every second lamppost in certain parts of Northern Ireland? Because although very few people would find it very easy to defend the flying of a Hezbollah flag in any circumstances, like flags that glorify or express some kind of support for prescribed paramilitary organisations are 10 a penny in Northern Ireland. And it's fascinating that this is the point upon which some police have chosen now to investigate and start to try and pursue prosecutions, when open glorification of terrorism is almost an everyday part. It's almost part of Northern Ireland's heritage at this point. It's almost progressively owned by some communities.
There is, you talk about flags like UVF flags and stuff are hung up in shared community or cross-community housing developments, council house developments in Belfast, specifically to intimidate people. Nothing ever seems to be done about that. Yeah. So that is the point you're making there on this. Zara, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, it is a shock. It is something obviously that was in train because they were being investigated, or they were investigating these incidents. But it is something which does come out of the blue at a time, of course, where there is such focus on what's actually happening in Gaza itself.
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of exactly what we said on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. I think we named the episode, "Are we missing the point when it comes to the Kneecap thing, or is the media missing the point?" I should say. Everyone is missing the point, and that's what Kneecap are saying in their own statement. They issued a statement saying they deny this offence and will vehemently defend ourselves. They say this is political policing and describe it as a carnival of distraction. And it's very difficult not to say that there's a point to be made in that statement there. This is not about Kneecap. And their point was never to be the headline. That was never their attempt in all of this. This was not what they wanted in all of this. And the fact that it's unfolding like this is... it's somewhat surprising, I would say. I mean, we knew that there was something in train. I just didn't really think it would come to this. Did you?
I mean, I think once you take the genie out of the bottle, I think it is very hard by letter of the law in terms of the insignia of a prescribed terror group. Once they say this is such a high profile case that they wouldn't get to a place where they would eventually have their day in court, as it were. The fact that it's come around so soon is perhaps something which is surprising in terms of, how quickly the wheels of justice have been greased here in this regard. It is interesting because, I mean, you brought in the context of the North. You could bring in the context of what's happening in the Middle East at the moment, where you have people like Donald Trump meeting the new Syrian president, who is formerly on a wanted list for being a member of Al-Qaeda, for example. If you waved an Al-Qaeda flag or an ISIS flag, this would happen to you as well. Now, as much as we're saying, and we have said previously before, the biggest story in the world is actually what's happening in Gaza, that stuff about Kneecap. These are all sub things, pale in comparison in terms of importance, in terms of what's going on in the world. The Hezbollah situation is, because some people have been messaging me saying, what is the big deal with Hezbollah? Hezbollah is an anti-Semitic organisation. Hezbollah is an anti-LGBT organisation. It is a terror group by whichever way you want to spin it. You can talk about the origins coming from Israeli interventions and incursions into South Lebanon, and this being a resistance group to start off with. But by any letter of the law, it is a terrorist organisation, and it is going to face repercussions displaying their insignia in a country like the UK. The last thing that happened yesterday, and it happened, news filtering through to us here in Ireland overnight, was the shooting dead of 2 officials at the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. A suspect has been apprehended. He seems to have said to police that he was very much the man behind it. This has been broadly condemned by people around the world. The killing of Sarah Lynn Milgram and Yaron Lishinsky, a couple in the prime of their lives, as they've been described, in Israel's embassy in the US. This has been condemned by Donald Trump, by the Israeli government, by officials around the world. And again, as we say, correctly, just in terms of what we saw happen in Jenin as well, anything involving diplomats, it is a red line. But of course, red lines have been crossed so often that it is important to sort of refocus that these are things which just should not happen. Yeah.
I mean, as much as we know at this point, the alleged perpetrator, the person who appears to have handed themselves over, admitted to police that they were the culprit in this instance. It wasn't necessarily doing it trying to portray himself as some kind of a state actor. Now, it was very clearly an anti-Semitic attack because he was seen pacing outside this Jewish museum where the 2 people were unfortunately injured, pacing over and back and effectively opening fire as soon as he saw anyone that he thought worthy of shooting at. So, although, yes, any attack on diplomats is dreadful, and in this instance it is very, very clearly an act of anti-Semitism, and an egregious one which cannot be endorsed by anybody, individual losers, individual wingnuts doing this is one thing, and it's dreadful and it shouldn't be acknowledged by anyone. But don't have official entities, don't have states pursuing similarly aggressive things to others. If diplomats are to be sacrosanct, and we all agree that they should be, they are representative of citizens of other countries, then let's apply that all across the board. It's dreadful when it happens in DC, but it's dreadful when anyone puts anyone else in harm's way anywhere else in the world as well, because those people are only just doing jobs and they should be allowed to do them.
Zara, what were your thoughts when you saw this headline coming this morning?
Yeah, so I just want to say to you, just as we're recording here, just seeing an update now from Al Jazeera that there is some limited aid getting into Gaza since we started recording in the last few moments. But obviously, the UN saying the amount of aid allowed in is nowhere near enough, obviously, but there's a small bit getting in today. Look, I agree with you, Gavan. I totally echo Gavan's sentiments on that. I think people who are going to work and trying to do their job and, have their own best of intentions should not be in this situation, but neither should civilians. I don't think that a diplomat's life is worth more than the life of a civilian.
No, absolutely not. It is going to be interesting to see how this progresses. Anti-Semitism has been a real concern. Going way back before anything that's happened in Gaza, anti-Semitism is a threat which has been reported from far-right groups. It has been, something which has existed in the Western world, in the modern world, for decades and decades and decades, and it shouldn't be minimised as a real thing in this world. It is going to be interesting to see how this fits in with the mesh, with the smorgasbord of different stories and different elements to what's happening in Gaza. The humanitarian situation there not improving whatsoever. It does appear that the pressing ahead with the Israeli offensive is going to continue. But I wonder, and some people are already raising the point about how will this impact that movement, that renewed focus from places like the US, like the UK, like France and Germany, where there hasn't been that groundswell of media attention and political pressure on Israel. Will that be quelled to some degree by what's happened in Washington, D.C. overnight? And that is a question which we just don't have the answer to at this point.